Hello, my name is Priscilla Chavez, and this is my Section 5 assignment. From the 1970s into the 21st century, America was shaped by challenges brought upon environment and energy crises, a shifting economy, and terrorism. Throughout my presentation, I will be defending my opinion that indeed the United States entered an era of decline when faced with these events. To start off, I will be discussing the energy and environmental crises. Before I jump into the energy crisis, I am going to explain some events that ignited the issue. In 1948, the Allied powers set aside some territory of Palestine to serve as the State of Israel. This state would serve as homeland for suppressed Jews. Unfortunately, surrounding Arab population refused to recognize the Israeli state. This refusal caused numerous full-scale conflicts. One of these Arab-Israeli wars was called the Yom Kippur War. In early October 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on their holy day Yom Kippur. After the Soviet Union began supporting Egypt and Syria with arms, President at the time Richard Nixon began resupplying Israel. In response, angered members of OPEC reduced petroleum production and placed an embargo on oil shipments to Israel's main supporters, who were the United States and the Netherlands. The embargo on oil production sparked an energy crisis. As you can see from this graph from Week 12 primary documents, in the 1970s, petroleum was the leading source of energy for America. So as you can imagine, when the price of oil shot from $3 per barrel to $12, Americans were in a frenzy. Now facing fuel shortages and not enough supply to meet demand, lines at gas stations formed around the country. America's heavy reliance on a foreign country's good left the country at their mercy. America allowed a foreign nation to obtain power and use it whenever they were discontent with America's actions. By doing so, this America caused major problems in the lives of consumers and in the automotive industry. For decades, the automotive industry had been creating larger and larger cars. Now, with this energy crisis, they were losing business to Japanese manufacturers that produced smaller, more fuel-efficient models. The oil embargo was lifted in March 1974, but oil prices remained high. This stimulated research into alternative renewable sources of energy, such as solar and nuclear power. Despite these attempts, progress toward energy efficiency slowed and foreign imports continued to increase throughout the 1980s. In the 1970s, the United States had a decline in environmental cleanliness and an increase in pollution. Some environmental issues at the time were oil spills, raw sewage, toxic dumps, loss of biodiversity and marine life, and pollution. Shown in this Week 12 primary document is a consequence of increasing number of factories and plants during the 1970s. This increase in factories and plants caused a number of problems, including air pollution and damaging runoff. Another major environmental concern was the use of pesticides and fertilizers in commercial agriculture. Widespread use of pesticides such as DDT resulted in severe consequences for humans and animals alike, such as poisoning. Oil spills also intoxicated the oceans, affecting loss of marine life and affecting surrounding areas. As shown in this Week 12 primary document, 2 young children play in the debris of environmental pollution. With pollution reaching so close to home, far more people began to concern themselves about the environmental health. They began to discuss that the government was failing to make effective laws to counteract the detrimental effects of industrialization. As a result, a series of relative policies were implemented in the 70s, such as the Clean Air Act signed off by Richard Nixon, the Endangered Species Act, and the Water Act, to name a few. Now I will be turning my attention to stagflation. By the 1970s, the U.S. economy began to face stagflation, which can be defined as a combination of unemployment, inflation, and stagnant demand. Although America was familiar with these dilemmas, they had never experienced all three at the same time. This posed as a major problem that caused economic policy during the 1960s and 1970s to be confusing and tedious. As you can tell in my image of stagflation, GDP lowers, unemployment rises, corporate earnings also lower, and inflation ultimately rises. To start off, people began to await higher prices of goods and therefore bought more. This increase pushed up prices, which in turn led to demand and higher wages. The government's need for more funds overwhelmed the budget deficit and led to greater government spending. Because government spending increased, so did interest rates and costs for businesses and consumers. With increased energy costs and higher interest rates, business investment decreased and unemployment reached an all-time high. Also causing unemployment was the shift of manufacturing abroad. Businesses could send their products to be created in foreign nations and at a lower cost. This caused an outsource of manufacturing jobs for hundreds of workers leaving them jobs. In response, President Jimmy Carter used the tactic of deregulation to fight inflation. The Carter administration was convinced that regulators too often protected the industries they were assigned to oversee. So President Carter deregulated numerous industries, including airlines, trucking, and railroads. Also in response to inflation, the Federal Reserve Board restrained the growth of money supply. Unemployment further increased and interest rates rose to their highest levels in the nation's history. Before I begin to speak about 9/11, I would like to take a moment to remember those who have been lost. On September 11, 2001, terrorists of Middle Eastern origin hijacked 4 U.S. airplanes. The first airplane, Flight 11 of American Airlines, crashed into the World Trade Center's North Tower at 8:45 a.m. The second airplane, United Flight 175, crashed into the World Trade Center South Tower at 9:03. Following shortly after at 9:40 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. Lastly, at 10 a.m., United Flight 93 crashed 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Officials believe the terrorists were aiming to destroy the White House or the U.S. Capitol. The terrorists that hijacked the planes were a part of a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was led by Osama bin Laden, and it is believed that the opposition to the United States military presence in Arab nations is what fueled such animosity. The attacks caused anxiety and panic throughout the nation. Americans present at the scenes ran for their lives, while Americans at home in untouched cities glued themselves to their local news, feeling helpless. Emergency personnel had no guide as how to follow protocol, and 911 phone lines filled up as many were put on hold various times. It was a time of pure chaos. In response, President Jimmy Carter used the tactic of deregulation to fight inflation. The Carter administration was convinced that regulators too often protected the industries they were assigned to oversee. So President Carter deregulated numerous industries, including airlines, trucking, and railroads. Also in response to inflation, the Federal Reserve Board restrained the growth of money supply. Unemployment further increased and interest rates rose to their highest levels in the nation's history. Shown in this Week 12 primary document is a consequence of increasing number of factories and plants during the 1970s. This increase in factories and plants caused a number of problems, including air pollution and damaging runoff. Another major environmental concern